In late 1978, a horror was unfolding right at Vietnam's doorstep, so brutal that even battle-hardened soldiers struggled to believe it was real. Villages along the southwestern border were being wiped out with a cruelty that felt almost medieval. Entire families were hacked apart in the middle of the night. Children were nailed to trees as a message. And the killers? They were not foreign invaders from some distant empire. They were Khmer Rouge fighters, Pol Pot's men, people who shared the same land, the same past, and for generations had lived next to Vietnam in uneasy peace. But now they had become something else entirely. Pol Pot had turned Cambodia into a living nightmare, a country where glasses made you an intellectual and being an intellectual meant you had to die. The regime believed that only through a complete purge of modern civilization could they create a perfect agrarian society. And like all utopias built on blood, this one needed endless sacrifices. Millions of Cambodians were worked to death in fields, beaten for resting, executed for hiding rice grains, or simply disappeared for not smiling enough during mandatory self-criticism sessions. But even that wasn't enough for Pol Pot. He needed an external enemy, someone he could blame for every failure of his government. And so he chose Vietnam. His propaganda machine screamed that Vietnam planned to swallow Cambodia. That the Khmer people must cleanse anyone who stood in their way. And with that one order, he unleashed a series of cross-border attacks that were designed not just to kill, but to terrorize. The first waves came fast, small squads of Khmer Rouge slipping across the border, torching houses, dragging villagers out, and leaving only ashes behind. But soon the attacks grew bigger and more coordinated. In April 1978, one of the worst massacres occurred at Ba Chuk, where over 3,000 Vietnamese civilians were slaughtered in cold blood. Women, children, elderly, no one was spared. People begged. People hid. People ran. It didn't matter. The killers walked from home to home, slashing, burning, laughing. It was savagery on a scale that twisted the stomach. Vietnam could no longer pretend this was just a border conflict. For months, the government had tried diplomacy. They sent envoys. Letters. Pleas. Demands to stop the attacks. Every attempt was answered by Pol Pot with more killings, more raids, more bodies lying in rice fields. And inside Vietnam, a dark question began to spread among ordinary people: if this continues, who will be next? Which town will burn tomorrow? How do you reason with a regime that thinks genocide is a form of purification? But even as fear spread, something else was forming: rage. Not the blind rage of panic, but the cold, sharp kind that comes from knowing you have no choice but to fight. Unit commanders along the border started sending desperate reports. Villagers armed themselves with sticks and hunting knives. Patrol teams discovered entire hamlets wiped clean, with only the smell of smoke and charred rice lingering in the air. Everyone knew what was coming. It wasn't a matter of if Vietnam would retaliate, it was when. Inside Hanoi, leaders gathered in rooms thick with cigarette smoke and frustration. They had just emerged from decades of war. The country was exhausted. Cities still lay in ruins. Families were still burying their dead from previous battles. No one wanted another war, especially not against a neighbor. But how long could they wait while Pol Pot butchered civilians and bragged on radio broadcasts about teaching Vietnam a lesson? Some generals argued patience, hoping the conflict might cool. Others demanded action. One commander slammed his fist against the table, shouting that Vietnam could not let Pol Pot turn Southeast Asia into a slaughterhouse. Intelligence reports showed that Khmer Rouge units were receiving Chinese weapons, training, and support. Pol Pot wasn't just a madman. He had backing. And he believed that Vietnam, still bruised and rebuilding, was vulnerable. But there was one thing he didn't understand about the Vietnamese people: they had spent 1,000 years fighting invaders. They knew how to survive. They knew how to push back. And they had faced giants far more powerful than him. As the year crawled toward its end, the attacks intensified. Villagers fled deeper inland. Border soldiers found bodies mutilated beyond recognition. Khmer Rouge troops planted landmines in places where children played. It became clear that Pol Pot wanted to force Vietnam into war on his terms, chaotic, unpredictable, bloody. But Vietnam didn't panic. Instead, something quiet and determined began to move beneath the surface. Troops were shifted south. Supply routes were reconnected. Medical stations prepared for casualties. And in the dark of night, commanders rehearsed plans they hoped they would never have to use. The country was waking up. The army was gathering strength. And every soldier knew exactly what they were fighting for. By December, the decision was made. Enough civilians had died. Enough warnings had been ignored. Enough blood had been spilled on the border to fill rivers. Vietnam would strike, not for revenge, but because there was no other way to stop the killing. As the order spread through the ranks, soldiers packed their gear with grim focus. Many wrote letters home, unsure if they would ever return. But they went anyway, because they knew the alternative: more massacres, more screams at midnight, more villages wiped from the map. And so, with the world watching in confusion, Vietnam prepared to face one of the most savage regimes of the 20th century. No one knew how long the fight would take. No one knew how many lives would be lost. But one thing was certain: Pol Pot had unleashed a storm he could never control. When the Vietnamese army finally moved, they moved like a blade slicing through darkness. The first strikes targeted border strongholds, places where Khmer Rouge forces had been launching their massacres for months. Soldiers advanced through dense forests, muddy plains, mine-ridden paths, and villages that still smelled of smoke. Every step forward revealed another layer of destruction Pol Pot had left behind. Every burned house, every shallow grave, every abandoned child pushed the soldiers harder. This was no longer a strategic operation. This was a moral one. Khmer Rouge forces expected Vietnam to be cautious, hesitant, weakened by years of previous wars. Instead, they met an army fueled by discipline, experience, and fury. Vietnamese infantry units cut through defensive lines with precision. Artillery teams dismantled enemy bunkers methodically. Engineers swept minefields with the calm efficiency of men who had spent their entire adult lives in conflict. The first week alone saw dozens of Khmer Rouge outposts fall, many collapsing almost instantly under the weight of Vietnam's assault. But the deeper Vietnam pushed, the darker the situation became. The Khmer Rouge didn't run a normal army. They ran a cult, one built on fear, paranoia, and absolute obedience. Their soldiers were often teenagers conditioned to believe that killing was a sacred duty. Many fought with a wild desperation, convinced they were protecting a revolution bigger than their own existence. Some units fought to the last man. Others abandoned their posts entirely, fleeing into the jungle. And then there were the infamous execution fields, places where Pol Pot had ordered mass killings of his own people. Vietnamese soldiers found piles of skulls, pits filled with bones, shreds of clothing covered in dirt. Even hardened veterans felt their stomachs twist. By the time Vietnamese forces reached deeper Cambodian territory, the scale of the genocide began to reveal itself. Entire villages were empty, their residents either worked to death or executed. Children wandered alone, too traumatized to speak. Survivors whispered about forced marriages, torture camps, and prisons where thousands entered but only ashes left. The soldiers had come expecting a war. What they found was hell. Meanwhile, Pol Pot sat in Phnom Penh convinced Vietnam would never reach him. His inner circle fed him lies, promising that their superior revolutionary spirit would defeat any conventional army. Chinese advisors urged him to keep fighting, claiming Vietnam was overextended and would collapse soon. And Pol Pot believed them, because believing anything else meant facing the truth: his regime was rotting from the inside. As Vietnamese troops pushed forward, they encountered bizarre behaviors from Khmer Rouge commanders. Some ordered their soldiers to fight until the last bullet and then slit their own throats. Others fled disguised as farmers. A few even carried out mass executions of prisoners before retreating, hoping to destroy evidence of their crimes. But the evidence was everywhere: torture rooms with blood still fresh on the floors, prisons filled with shackles, fields where the earth bulged from bodies buried just days before. Back on the front lines, Vietnam kept advancing, but it wasn't easy. The Khmer Rouge relied heavily on guerrilla tactics, ambushes along narrow jungle paths, surprise attacks at night, traps designed to cut off limbs or impale anyone unlucky enough to step wrong. Vietnamese soldiers fought in conditions so brutal that every kilometer gained felt like a lifetime. But they kept going, driven by a clarity that came from witnessing Pol Pot's horrors up close. One day, a small Vietnamese unit entered a village where dozens of people had been tied to trees and left to starve. A woman, barely alive, whispered that she hadn't eaten in 5 days. A child clung to a soldier's leg with fingers like sticks. The unit radioed for medical aid, but supplies were stretched thin. Soldiers shared their rations, their canteens, anything they had. Some cried quietly as they worked because they realized the war was no longer just about stopping border raids. It was about saving an entire country from being extinguished. As Vietnamese forces neared Phnom Penh, Pol Pot's confidence cracked. He ordered mass evacuations, not to save civilians, but to use them as human shields. Tens of thousands were marched into the wilderness with almost no food or water. Vietnamese scouts trailed these columns, horrified at what they saw. It was a death march disguised as a retreat. Inside Vietnam, news of the campaign spread. Families who had lost loved ones along the border waited for any word. Some prayed for the soldiers, others prayed for the civilians trapped under Pol Pot. When the government announced that the army was making rapid progress, relief mixed with dread. Everyone knew the Khmer Rouge would not give up easily. They were fighting not for their country, but for the twisted ideology that had consumed them. Yet despite the chaos, a quiet determination settled over the Vietnamese troops. They were not here to conquer. They were here to break the machine of genocide and put an end to the massacres that had stained the border for months. And with each mile they advanced, the regime's lies crumbled. By late December, only one major step remained, taking Phnom Penh itself. And the Vietnamese army was ready. Phnom Penh was a silent city long before the first Vietnamese soldiers saw its skyline. Pol Pot had emptied it years earlier, believing cities were symbols of corruption. What had once been a bustling capital was now a ghost metropolis, a place where weeds pushed through pavement and buildings stood like hollow shells. The remaining Khmer Rouge units fortified key roads, set traps along intersections, and waited for an attack they claimed would never break their lines. But deep inside, many of them knew the truth: Vietnam was coming, and nothing was going to stop them. When the final offensive began, it came from multiple directions at once. Columns of Vietnamese infantry moved swiftly, supported by tanks and artillery. They expected fierce resistance, but what they found was chaos. Many Khmer Rouge fighters, demoralized and half-starved, abandoned their positions as soon as they heard engines rumbling. Some threw down their weapons and fled. Others tried to blend into the civilian population. The fanatic core loyal to Pol Pot made last-ditch stands, short, violent bursts of gunfire that were quickly silenced. Vietnamese soldiers pushed into the city cautiously, mindful of traps. They found roads lined with corpses of people who had collapsed during forced evacuations. They found hospitals without doctors, classrooms without children, markets without food. The city felt like it had been drained of life. And yet, somewhere among the empty streets, Pol Pot's regime was still pretending it could win. At key government buildings, Vietnamese forces discovered documents revealing the scale of the atrocities, lists of executions, torture instructions, confessions forced under beatings and electric shocks. Rooms filled with shackles. Walls stained with the marks of desperate fingernails. Soldiers had expected brutality, but this was industrialized horror. One commander wrote in his journal that Phnom Penh felt like a capital built on the bones of the innocent. But the most haunting discovery came from what remained of Security Prison 21, Tol Sleng. The Vietnamese troops who entered the building walked through rooms filled with photographs of prisoners taken before execution. Faces of men, women, teenagers, infants. Fear frozen forever in their expressions. Bloodstains still darkened sections of the floor. Rusted shackles clung to bed frames like claws. The silence in those rooms felt heavy, suffocating. Some soldiers turned away. Others whispered prayers. No one spoke loudly. On January 7, 1979, after days of fighting, Vietnamese troops completed their sweep of Phnom Penh. Pol Pot and his top commanders had fled into the jungle. The Khmer Rouge administration collapsed, leaving behind only ruins and ghostly records of their crimes. Cambodians who had been hiding in the countryside slowly began to emerge. They approached the Vietnamese soldiers cautiously at first, but when they realized the troops meant no harm, the fear in their eyes melted into something else, relief. They hugged the soldiers. They offered whatever food they had, a handful of rice, a piece of dried root. Some wept openly, thanking the troops for bringing an end to a nightmare that had held their country hostage for nearly 4 years. Vietnamese medics treated wounded civilians, sharing medical supplies that were intended for soldiers. The army set up food stations and water distribution points. For many Cambodians, it was the first time in years they had eaten a full meal. But despite the liberation, Vietnam knew the war wasn't over. Pol Pot's remaining forces had retreated to the Thai border, where they set up fortified camps with foreign support. For the next decade, Vietnamese troops would stay in Cambodia to help stabilize the new government and hunt down Khmer Rouge remnants. It wasn't an occupation for conquest. It was a mission to prevent the genocide from returning. Inside Vietnam, reactions were mixed. Some celebrated the fall of Pol Pot, grateful that the massacres had finally ended. Others worried about the cost of keeping troops in Cambodia. Families wrote letters to their sons, praying they would survive the long, grueling fight against the remnants of the Khmer Rouge in the jungles. Meanwhile, Western nations and China condemned Vietnam, accusing it of invasion. They pretended not to see the genocide, preferring to protect geopolitical interests rather than acknowledge the truth. The world turned its back on Cambodia's suffering, but Vietnam did not. Vietnamese soldiers continued to patrol villages, escort food trucks, protect farmers, and dismantle Khmer Rouge cells hiding along the border. In the jungles, the remaining Khmer Rouge fighters were still dangerous. They planted mines everywhere. They ambushed convoys. They kidnapped villagers who cooperated with the new government. The Vietnamese army responded with relentless patrols, determined not to let Pol Pot regain any foothold. It was a long, draining war, but for the soldiers who had seen Ba Chuk, who had seen Tol Sleng, who had seen children starving on the roadside, the mission was personal. Years passed. Slowly, Cambodia began to heal. Schools reopened. Rice fields were cultivated again. Markets buzzed with life. And through it all, Vietnamese troops stayed, earning respect from the people they protected. Some soldiers became so close to Cambodian families that they were treated like sons. Others built friendships that lasted long after they returned home. The Khmer Rouge began to fracture. Pol Pot's leadership splintered under pressure. Internal betrayals and power struggles weakened them further. And by the late 1980s, their influence was collapsing. Cambodia was no longer the torture chamber it had been. It had hope. It had children laughing again. It had farmers planting seeds without fear of being executed for hoarding. And at the center of that fragile rebirth was the Vietnamese soldier, tired, scarred, but determined. The war had taken a toll. Many never returned home. Others returned with memories they would carry for a lifetime. But they knew why they fought, and they knew what they had saved. They had broken the spine of one of the most savage regimes in modern history. And they had done it not for glory, but because no one else would. When Vietnamese soldiers finally began withdrawing from Cambodia in the late 1980s, they left behind a country that was no longer drowning in terror. What had once been a landscape of killing fields, abandoned villages, and mass graves was slowly transforming into a society rebuilding itself from the ruins. The soldiers who marched home did so quietly, without parades or fanfare. Many felt a strange mix of pride and exhaustion. They had not gone to Cambodia as conquerors. They had gone as neighbors trying to save neighbors. And the weight of what they had witnessed would stay with them forever. The world, however, refused to acknowledge the truth. Western governments, locked in Cold War politics, labeled Vietnam the aggressor. International newspapers called the operation an invasion. China punished Vietnam with a border war of its own. But the soldiers knew what they had seen. The Cambodian survivors knew who had liberated them. And decades later, when documents were released and mass graves were uncovered, the world finally admitted what Vietnam had known all along: Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge had orchestrated one of the worst genocides in human history. Back in Vietnam, families welcomed their sons home with relief. But many soldiers struggled to adapt. Some had nightmares. Some woke up sweating, hearing echoes of gunfire or the cries of starving children. Others carried guilt for the ones they couldn't save. And yet, when asked if they regretted the mission, most would shake their heads. They knew the price of doing nothing would have been far worse. As Cambodia slowly stabilized, stories began circulating, stories from survivors about the moment Vietnamese troops arrived in their villages. One woman recalled hiding in a pit with her daughter for 3 days, expecting Khmer Rouge soldiers to come back and finish them. When she heard Vietnamese voices instead, she didn't believe it at first. It seemed impossible that the nightmare could actually be over. Another survivor told how a Vietnamese medic saved his life by giving him the last of his own medicine. These stories spread quietly, carried by those who lived through the darkest years of their country's history. Meanwhile, in the jungles, Pol Pot and his loyalists continued their futile fight. But the world had changed. International support waned. Diseases spread through the rebel camps. Morale crumbled. By the late 1990s, Pol Pot himself was betrayed by his own commanders and died under house arrest, a miserable, forgotten old man who had once dreamed of reshaping the world through terror. Cambodia began to rebuild its culture, its traditions, its soul. Monks returned to temples that had been converted into prisons. Children learned in classrooms that once echoed with screams. Farmers plowed fields that had been killing grounds. Life slowly pushed back against the shadows of death. And though the scars remained, etched into the hearts of survivors and the soil beneath their feet, the country refused to surrender to its past. Vietnam watched this recovery with quiet satisfaction. No statues were built for the soldiers who had fought. No grand anniversaries were held in their honor. But in the memories of Cambodian survivors, those soldiers were not invaders, they were the ones who had broken open the gates of hell and pulled them out. Years later, when historians studied the conflict, many admitted an uncomfortable truth: Vietnam had done what powerful nations refused to do. They had stopped a genocide. They had toppled a regime built on torture, starvation, and madness. And they had paid a high price for it: lives lost, decades of diplomatic isolation, and a war that lasted far longer than they ever expected. But war stories don't end with battles. They end with what comes after. And what came after was a region that finally had a chance to breathe. Cambodia survived. Vietnam secured its borders. And Southeast Asia avoided a future where one man's obsession with purity could have erased entire peoples. For the Vietnamese soldiers who fought, the memory of Cambodia lived on in quiet moments: faces of children they saved, ruined villages they passed through, the haunting silence of Tol slang. They did not need recognition. They had seen the truth for themselves. And that was enough. Today, when people look back on the fall of the Khmer Rouge, they often ask a simple question: how did Vietnam defeat such a savage regime? The answer isn't found in strategy alone. It isn't just in the firepower, or the tactics, or the battle plans. It lies in something deeper, something Pol Pot never understood. Vietnam fought with purpose. The soldiers crossed the border not to conquer, but to end a nightmare. They marched into a genocide with the determination of a people who had spent centuries fighting for freedom, not just their own, but for anyone who needed it. Pol Pot's forces fought for fear. Vietnam fought for life. And in the end, life won. But the story doesn't truly end here. Because what happened after the war, what happened in the jungles, in the villages, in the hearts of survivors, is another chapter entirely. A chapter about forgiveness, justice, and the long road to healing.